Good afternoon. My name is Tannas Farsi, professor in the Department of Art, and I'm delighted to introduce Lumi Tan as the Ford Family Foundation's 2021 Critical Conversations Curator and Critic Tour Visitor for the University of Oregon. I'd like to begin by recognizing that the University of Oregon is located on the traditional indigenous homelands of the Kalapuya people, who were dispossessed of their land by the US government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon following treaties between 1851 and 55. In acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we extend our respect to Kalapuya descendants who are primarily citizens of the Confederate tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederate tribes of Siletz Indians, and to the indigenous people of Oregon as they continue to make important contributions to our region and beyond. We pledge our commitment to make ongoing efforts to center Indigenous existence in the work that we do. The Ford Family Foundation's Visual Arts program honors the foundation's late co-founder, Haley Ford, and her lifelong interest in the arts by helping Oregon's most promising visual artists actively pursue their work. One element of the program is Critical Conversations, a collaboration between the foundation and the University of Oregon, in partnership with the Pacific Northwest College of Art, Portland State University, and Reed College. Critical Conversations is a space for the work of artists and cultural producers that manifests as fertile medium through which exchange, collaboration, and new forms of inquiry are catalyzed. Organizing partners facilitate a year-round calendar of studio visits for Oregon artists by 3 prominent visiting curators or critics, host related public lectures and other forms of engagement with these visitors, and oversee a series of convenings that engage community participants around currents in society and the field. In addition to today's events, or to events like today's, engagement is made accessible to broader audiences through a variety of platforms, including Critical Conversations annual publication, which gathers content from a range of activities and commissioned writing around a theme. The inaugural recent publication of this initiative is dedicated to the notion of figuring. In addition to today's talk and studio visits with Oregon artists, Lumi will also contribute a piece of writing to the next year's publication. And now to get to the work of Lumi Tan, who is the Senior Curator at The Kitchen, NYC's oldest nonprofit space that has continually presented groundbreaking interdisciplinary projects since 1971. Since 2010, Lumi has organized exhibitions and produced performances with artists across many disciplines and generations. Most recently, the artists have included Kevin Beasley, Baseera Khan, Autumn Night, and Kenneth Tam. Her previous lauded curatorial projects include Gretchen Bender, Meriem Bennani, Liz Magic Laser, the Racial Imaginary Institute, Sahra Motalebi, Sondra Perry, Anicka Yi, and Dan Vo, among others. Prior to the kitchen, Tan was guest curator at the Fonds Régional Contemporain in France, director at Zach Feuer Gallery, and curatorial assistant at P.S.1 Contemporary Art Center. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Artforum, Frieze, Mousse, Cura, and numerous exhibition catalogues. Most recently, she was a recipient of 2020 VIA Art Fund Curatorial Fellowship. After Lumi's talk, we will have time for questions, and you can use the Q&A feature to drop your questions throughout the lecture. I will now turn the screen over to Lumi. Welcome, Lumi.
Thank you Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me. I want to send a special thank you to Brian Gillis, even though he couldn't be here, for the initial invitation to participate in the Critical Conversations program, and to the Ford Family Foundation for funding such an important. I wish I could be in person in Oregon with all of you, but for funding such a great exchange between curators and critics outside of Oregon and artists inside of Oregon. But I look forward, if there are some artists that I'm meeting with Oregon in the audience, I look forward to meeting you virtually over the next few weeks. So let me just share my screen and we can get started. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So I started working at the kitchen in 2011 and came from a background working in exhibitions and museums and galleries that didn't have much engagement in performance. You know, it was always something that was kind of on the side for entertainment or educational purposes. And as I grew into my role at the kitchen and began to understand more about the institution, I realized that my primary concern was not about, you know, understanding how performance and exhibitions can live within a building together, but how that relationship and cohabitation affects institutional value systems. You know, when you think about a museum, if you can tell a kind of clear, concise story that doesn't allow for too much ambiguity or, you know, a space to challenge a trajectory, you know, a specific trajectory, then that's very easy to kind of consume. And, you know, that pertains both to artists as individuals and what they're purported to represent and the presentations of their work. And qualities like paternalism, objectivity, defensiveness are all aspects of the museum that I think are recognizable to this audience, and qualities that have been, you know, detrimental to the museum model. And I think that we're all kind of working to change as members of the artistic community currently. But so, you know, qualities like emotion, vulnerability, slowness, transparency, those are not qualities that are associated with, like, let's say, the mainstream art world or encyclopedic museums, for example. There are terms that are tied to performance and, you know, and how it's billed as this kind of like alternative to visual art, and also is seen as less valued and receives less attention, resources, and consideration by institutions. So the kitchen's historical role as an alternative space has always been to offer opportunities to kind of move away from that authoritative narrative of the traditional museum and to always kind of offer this hypothetical, right? And in many ways to complicate a narrative and seeing benefits to that complication and to that potential confusion. And I think you'll see through the projects that I speak about tonight that it doesn't, you know, this confusion doesn't mean illegibility. That ultimately by embracing these more open-ended practices and projects that, you know, you're allowing for many different means of access and many different publics at once. But of course, it's inevitable that, you know, an alternative space like the kitchen becomes an established institution over time as it grows and attempts not to only stay relevant, but to survive. And, you know, we have, of course, taken on, you know, many of the standards and habits of museums and larger institutions. And so just to address this kind of institutional trajectory, I'll first start with a very brief history of the kitchen for those who are not familiar, before delving into a few projects that I hope, communicate the ideas around these institutional values that I brought up previously. So the kitchen was started in 1971 by two video artists, Steina and Woody Vasilka. And so this is the original kitchen, which is in the Soho neighborhood of New York, which was, you know, a very vibrant artistic community at the time. And Steina and Woody started this space specifically for video because it was a burgeoning field, and that there weren't a lot of resources around video. And so, you know, they wanted to start the kitchen as a gathering space, as kind of community space for video artists, but also very quickly integrated the work of kind of anyone working in electronic media, including electronic musicians, because all of these artists were working with the same kind of materials in terms of, you know, like making DIY synthesizers and modulators and, you know, really having to kind of rely on themselves to make things happen. So this is a view of the original kitchen, which was inside of an existing arts institution called the Mercer Art Center. And you can see that, you know, it's in an actual kitchen, but it doesn't look like an actual kitchen. It doesn't it doesn't look like a gallery. It doesn't look like a performance space necessarily. It's kind of, you know, just kind of an open space where performance and video could kind of commingle with each other. And so that trajectory, that architecture, that kind of like feeling continued into our next space, which was also in Soho, just a few blocks away. And that space we moved into in 1973, and the Vasulkas stepped down from their leadership position to really focus on being artists. And the kitchen became, a larger, somewhat larger institution, in terms of having like a director and artists who served as curators. And we also expanded our interdisciplinary programming in this space. So, in addition to video and electronic music, we started doing exhibitions, theater, other types of performance art, dance, literature events, film screenings, and, showing all other types of music beyond electronic music, particularly minimal noise and experimental jazz music. So just to show you a few images of this space, this is an early Joan Jonas performance that was in the loft, a Vito Acconci exhibition, and this is a Beastie Boys concert from, I believe, 1983. And I always show this photo because you can see, not only the architecture of the loft, but like how the audience was seated. And that's very rare in our archives to be able to see how the audience is actually interacting with performance. And here it's like, it's a bit funny that it's just like a hardcore show. I think it was the Beastie Boys, Swans, and Sonic Youth were all in one bill. And, everyone's just like seated and like very, seems very like proper in a way, which is not at all how you would imagine like an experimental music concert in, the mid 80s in Soho. So then this is our present building, which is in the Chelsea neighborhood of New York. And so, a lot of things happened in the transition between us moving from the Soho loft to this Chelsea building. And so, the primary one was the neighborhood. We were moving from a space that was really, when we left Soho, had a very dense concentration of contemporary art galleries and still had many artists living there. When we moved to Chelsea, it was much less of a place where you would go see visual art, but much more of a place where you would go dancing or see music. Like nightlife was really the thing in the neighborhood to do. And so, that affected the kind of programming we were doing. And then also the spaces that we moved into affected the programming we were doing. So instead of one big loft where all these different disciplines would happen, we instead were moving into a space that had two black box theaters on top of each other. So the first floor and the second floor were black box theaters, and then the third floor was our offices. And that model kind of continued until, the early 2000s, when we turned the second floor from the black box theater into a white cube gallery. And so at present, this is the kind of situation that I curated. And, there are two spaces for exhibitions and performances. And, as a curator, I'm, working through that kind of interdisciplinary relationship, but I'm also working, through these ideas of like where the kitchen is now in terms of like the ecosystem of, New York City, New York City's cultural institutions, which there are many of. There's a lot of changing relationships to, or a lot of drastically changed relationships to the market, for example, in terms of like how artists are so like quickly implicated in the market systems. So, the artists that you show at the kitchen are also showing at MoMA or a blue chip gallery potentially, but they're also showing at an apartment gallery, or they could also be showing at Lincoln Center. They could also be showing at DIY music venue, or, maybe they're not showing anywhere else besides the kitchen. So there's kind of like, many different ways that the kitchen can kind of work within this ecosystem. And, the most basic questions are that we're asking at, our 50th anniversary now is just, how is the kitchen still an alternative? And, what can the kitchen offer when there's so many places to show, when you don't have, let's just say, the financial resources of a commercial gallery or the museum, especially as museums grow much more interested in performance and are offering spaces like black boxes or these kind of gray cubes that many of them are developing. And, you know, how can an institution stay relevant when there's like kind of close-knit community around them? You know, that was originally in Soho or even in the early days of Chelsea, it no longer exists because everyone's so decentralized now. And so, you know, the title of this talk, this invisible rooms phrase that I've been using, and it just alludes to one strategy that I have felt has become increasingly important to artists working within these differently scaled institutions. But one that I feel like the kitchen is kind of been really permissive about, let's say. You know, we're really allowing the institution to exist as this kind of like non-space or to be invisible rather than to dominate the artist, like to create more of a container that links the building to a site of production rather than to just presentation, as you might see in a museum. And, you know, a lot of this, I think, overall is just trying to get away from like a either or model or like to go somewhere towards both and, you know, not either the white cube or the black box, but, you know, what can we learn from both modes of like this false neutrality of both those spaces, or false invisibility of both of those spaces, and how can we find value in those voids, and how do these various modalities affect the artists and the audiences that come into them. So I'll start by talking about two. I'm going to call them more traditional projects, even though I don't, you know, I think that they're very experimental. But I'll talk about two more traditional projects before moving into ones that I consider kind of just more expansive. And so the first one I'll talk about is just kind of briefly touch on it to show an example of like programming we do, performance programming that we do in our Black Box Theater, is a play by Tina Satter and her company Half Straddle, which is an experimental theater company that forefronts queer femme relationships. And Tina is, was the fourth project that I've worked on with Tina over the years at the kitchen. And this is a play called Is This a Room? And Is This a Room has the kind of the appearance of the most like traditional show or the most traditional narrative that perhaps we've presented together at the kitchen. But it's based on, well, it's not based on, the script of this play is the verbatim transcript of an FBI interrogation of Reality Winner, who was an NSA whistleblower who received the longest whistleblower sentence in American history for leaking documents related to Russian interference in the 2016 election. And so Tina took this transcript and just directly made it into a play. That's something that Tina has never done before. Tina always writes her own scripts. And, you know, by kind of using that transcript by, as you can see, there's like no set basically at all, just really focused on these, there are four characters, four kind of like positions within this play. It really highlights the kind of like gender dynamics and the just power structures at play within this, hour-long interaction that led to Reality being arrested. And, you know, as I mentioned, that there is like a narrative trajectory there that might not have been seen in Tina's previous plays with us, but, you know, it took a very circuitous route to get to this place through our work together at the kitchen. As I mentioned, it was the fourth project we worked on together. And, you know, the first time we worked together, it was on a very loose kind of like work in progress workshop structure that we built together. The second was a more, it was an evening length play that was like less, I guess like straightforward, I would say, in the story or the narrative. And then we also worked together on this, totally anonymous project for Tina, which was in the gallery of the kitchen, which was a series of public programs called Here I Go, Part 2 of You that we did in 2016. And, Tina invited people that she really respected from performance community, from the queer community. This is Sheila and Teely, who's a trans activist, to just speak about their work. And Tina created this kind of situation within the gallery to make everyone feel, very comfortable in speaking very frankly about kind of like what they kind of consider their position within their, within their work, within their identity. And Tina also used this space as a rehearsal space for Half Straddle's company. She kind of put up like these installations by other artists that were in Half Straddle's kind of circle. We had a zine making workshop. We had like local teen bands play every night between the lectures. It was just like a really different, active space that was, had a very different engagement with her audience, outside of experimental theater and outside of that kind of like, that, just more like one-to-one, you're consuming this piece and, leaving relationship. So then the next project I'll talk about also took place in the gallery. And this is Anicka Yi's You Can Call Me F, which is an exhibition that we did in 2015. And, Anicka is a sculptor who works a lot with scent and the intersections of biology and technology. She currently has a major commission at the Tate Turbine Hall that I'm very sad to miss. But, this was an example of a show, with an artist who this was one of 3 solo institutional shows that Anicka had this year in 2015. And so, the conversations we had were really deeply about like how to differentiate this show from the other shows, which were, in very different spaces. One was at MIT List, which is, kind of a exhibition space within an academic setting. And then the other one was at Kunsthal Basel. So that's more of like an, independent, it's a Kunsthal. So it's a larger institution with different funding models in Switzerland. But, the ways that Anicka was thinking about doing this presentation in the Kitchens Gallery were really, tied to performance and kind of time-based work, which is not necessarily like how she was thinking about her sculptural practice, but like, we ended up creating this very performative exhibition, in terms of the relationship between the audience and the art objects. And, she really used the kind of theatrical aspects of this is, what I call our White Cube Theater. As you can see, our White Cube Gallery. So you can see it's not white at all at this point. It's very dark. But really like using the theatrical aspects of this space. And so the concept of this show, well, I'll show you the next slide first. So the concept of this show was to talk about the fear of like contamination. And, this is obviously a very relevant topic right now. And it's one that we've come back to. This is a show we've come back to a lot during COVID. But specifically here, she was talking about this like contamination in a few different ways. So this show was created during the time of Ebola, and this kind of fear of this like, this exotic virus coming from another country and invading New York. And there was this really palpable kind of like paranoia in the city around touching people, around, touching subway poles and all of that. And so she connected this to a fear of like feminist networks and the kind of power of like collaboration in that sense. And so the first work that you saw when you came in the gallery was this like large petri dish billboard that she called it, that spells "You Can Call Me F," the title of the show. And it was made with the bacteria of 100 different women within her own networks. So these are people who were her friends, people who worked with her, her collectors, myself, people who worked at the kitchen, anyone that she kind of, came into contact with that identified as female, that she would take a swab and, we synthesized all of that bacteria together into one kind of super bacteria with the help of a biologist at MIT. And she used that bacteria to make this petri dish that would grow and change throughout the exhibition. And so you kind of came upon that, and people kind of thought there was this like terrible smell associated with it. There actually wasn't a smell associated with it at all. It was just kind of their own projected fears. But you walked then further into the gallery and you saw this kind of what she called a quarantine camp, which were like these little, these kind of tents that, they were building in like the airports to like contain people who are coming from treating Ebola patients, and were kind of all over the news at that point. But she built these kind of individual ecosystems, or what she called the individual kind of sculptural ecosystems within each of these tents. And the only smell that was actually being pumped through the air was the smell of Gagosian Gallery, which, as many of you know, is a very, blue chip gallery with locations all over the world. It's a scent that she captured, she captured and replicated synthetically. But the kind of like paradox was that, that a place like Gagosian doesn't smell like anything. It's not supposed to refer to the body. It's supposed to just like be a place where you kind of like get away from the body, get away from your senses, and really focus on like the transactional, like luxury object of art. And so Anicka here was really playing with that, like with those kinds of like fears and paranoias, and making things like palpable or visible that typically aren't. And so I will now I'm like realizing we don't even have that much time, but I'm now going to move into two projects that I kind of refer to as more expansive, but there are two projects that took over the whole of the kitchen's building and kind of give you a different sense of how to see these two spaces, not as like independent from each other, but much more integrated and kind of holistic. So this is a project that I did with Kevin Beasley in June 2019 called Assembly. And I think for some of you, you probably know that Kevin is, primarily, I would say, known as a sculptor, but, had many intersections with sound and performance within his work. And, we had been talking for many years about what the most appropriate program to do at the kitchen would be, given how many opportunities he has, how many institutional opportunities he has. And in particular, this was a year when he was coming off his first solo institutional show at the Whitney Museum, which is just a few blocks away from the kitchen. And so, how to really, again, differentiate this presentation at the kitchen from other institutional shows. And so a big part of this was, having just had this big solo exhibition moment, which, he was so proud of, but, wanted to pivot from, let's say, he really wanted to remove his authorship and the kind of markings of like what made, I think, a visual arts space, or what defines a visual arts space. So what he did was to strip away the markers of the 3 floors of the kitchen, including our offices, which is what you see in this photo with the performance artist Pamela Z. These are actually our offices that Kevin has, like, we took down a bunch of walls. We, took away a lot of the lighting, we kind of just, again, stripped away all the markers of it being an office. But, he was also thinking about the transition, the kitchen's transition to Chelsea in the mid 80s, and how, this context of nightlife and clubs shifted the programming, and also, that the kind of, before we moved into this model of exhibition performance space, Black Box and White Cube, we just had this one loft space that encouraged experimentation in a different way. And so, as I mentioned, he stripped away all the markers of these 3 floors and installed his own video lighting and sound systems for each floor. So here, this is our offices, as I mentioned. These are 3 video screens. Then he set up kind of like a standard lighting rig for performers to use. And then this is our 2nd floor gallery. So you can see, again, it's very dark. Kevin installed these, multiple monitors, projection screens, this neon lighting, this really immense, like, kind of club sound system, and had performers work within that structure. This is Misa, who is the pop persona of the visual artist E. Jane. And then this is our theater space. So this is kind of the only space that Kevin installed a lighting and sound system that referred to his material practice. So here he's put the lighting and sound system within a chandelier of rosin covered clothing, which is a very popular motif in his sculpture. And performing below it is the jazz pianist and artist Jason Moran, who's a very frequent collaborator of Kevin's. Jason has this piano lid that Kevin made for him, again, of resin soaked clothing that's kind of, drawing up to this chandelier. And so, this was the structure that Kevin made, invited performers in, program 3 weekends. Each date there were 3 performers, 1 on each floor. And beyond just, I think I've shown you mainly music and sound, but performers also included choreographers such as Angie Pittman and David Thompson, the performance artist Richard Kennedy. And, some of these performers had known our space for decades and years, and some were brand new. And so, the audience would arrive for one of these shows and travel throughout these spaces, kind of knowing the artists who were going to be performing on each floor, but like not necessarily not knowing the order they were going to be in. So there was this kind of, an openness on the sense of the audience, in terms of, maybe you're only coming to see one artist, but you're being exposed to 2 others that you don't know of, or, you came to see Jason Moran, who's a jazz pianist, and played a really beautiful set. But before that, on the 2nd floor was Wetware, which is an industrial noise band. And then before that, I think it was like Who is Schizo, who's a young rapper. So, like the experiences could be quite like dissonant in that way. And, that was something that Kevin really planned for. And, beyond the kind of taking away the markers of these spaces, we also, discussed all these just like really small, what you think of as small decisions, especially like, let's say as a curator, these are not necessarily at the top of your list, but like all these different things that made the spaces accessible in different ways, right? So we made tickets. We couldn't make them free because we were afraid of capacity issues, but we made them $5. So like, we had a very low ticket price. We made it free for children under 18. So we, made it clear that children were welcome to come with their parents or as teenagers. We moved the performance times up earlier in the afternoon. We had a lot of free refreshments so that people wouldn't get like tired, being in this building for 3 hours. And so all of these like different, just like kind of like, again, like transforming what he was entering as like a visual arts space into one more associated, let's say, with the club or music venues, these spaces of like noise and sound that he felt like were, much more welcoming spaces, let's say, were kind of present in all these small decisions that we made together. And so then I will talk about this next project, which, Kevin's, I think working with Kevin and working on Assembly really influenced us into, again, like moving into spaces that weren't necessarily white cubes or black boxes, but also to make more tangible investments in like process. And so we moved to this kind of residency model where we would offer kind of process-based residencies or project-based residencies to artists for 4 to 6 weeks instead of, having them come in for a very brief time of tech and then a presentation at the end of the week, or come in for a week of install and then have the exhibition immediately. But this decision also coincided with COVID. So this threw a lot of, performance practices and the institutions that support them into peril. So I'll just talk about, I'll talk about one project that I did out of many for online presentation in 2020. But so this is a performance by Autumn Night. And this was the first project that we did after closing for COVID. And for those of you who do not know Autumn's practice, Autumn's performance artist who's who's trained in theater, also became an art therapist before moving into kind of more museum, gallery spaces associated with visual art to present her work in addition to kind of theatrical venues as well. But in her work, there's a lot of reliance on the audience, making the audience improvise alongside of her. And her work, I know it's been presented at PICA, but if you ever have a chance to see Autumn's work, please, take it, because it's really incredible and precise and hilarious and kind of cutting, and makes you very self-aware, let's say. And so, this being COVID, we had a lot of conversations about what happens to her performance, without these audiences, what aspects of liveness were most important to her. And, she was really just interested. She had no fears about just like moving ahead during COVID to make something as soon as it was safe. And so, a few months after her residency was planned, we decided to kind of move ahead and, do this first on, kind of really ambitious online project together. And so what we ended up doing was just have Autumn in the kitchens building, again, all 3 floors, to work with a lighting designer and a sound designer, and to use the kitchen not only as like a set, but as a collaborator. And so, the way that Autumn put it was just that she was maintaining the building through her performance and manufacturing energy for no audience, which I think is a really beautiful way to put it. And so over 4 weeks, she created 3 2.5-hour long solo performances that were completely improvised and live streamed on the kitchen's Twitch account. And they were filmed with 7 cameras, 2 camera operators, a live editor that was mixing the footage, all live. and then overlaying it with sound and animations by Autumn's collaborator, Adebukola Bundaran. And so this first performance, I'll just show you a few images, used our third floor offices, which you can see here. And this is also an office, was our executive director's office at the time. It also used our kitchen and the wood shop. And then the second performance used our gallery space. This is the second floor. And then the third performance used our roof, our box office, our dressing room, and our first floor theater, which is what you can see here. And all of these performances are archived on the kitchen's website if you are interested in seeing them, which I hope you are. But you know, one of the frameworks for this residency was The Wiz, which is the 1978 version of The Wizard of Oz with a really iconic all Black cast. And, you know, like in The Wizard of Oz, at the end of the film, you know, the Wiz is revealed to be a normal guy. In this case, played by Richard Pryor, who's been operating, you know, this powerful facade. And so Knight also conceived of herself kind of within our dormant space as someone who is considering the machinery behind the production of images. And, you know, as the kitchen was sealed off from its public, working in isolation and performing with the remnants and evidence of not only our staff, but, you know, the bodies that inhabited the space most days, and traces of former performances and exhibitions through leftover props, wall text, and building modifications. So again, you know, working with the space as it was left in March, when, you know, I'm sure you're all very familiar, there was some space you left in March kind of as is, like, you know, you thought you're only going to be gone for 2 weeks, but then never returned to for months. And so, you know, thinking through that, that kind of role and position in terms of like being behind the scenes, but also like, you know, not wanting to reveal herself, also acknowledging her role kind of as like a guest within this building. That a lot of that was expressed through the kind of fragmentation of Autumn's body throughout the performances. She instructed the camera operators to avoid her face as much as possible and to never see her body whole. And so I know that contradicts some of the images that you saw, like this one, for example. She allowed our photographer, Paula Court, to, you know, kind of capture the entire process. So like to frame Autumn's entire body, or to include cameras in the documentation. But if you go and watch just the videos, you know, you will see an entirely different performance than like what I'm showing you in these images. You know, you see cameras really zooming in on Autumn's hands and feet, and Autumn's doing all these really like kind of ASMR like actions where she's popping bubble wrap or squeezing a lemon or ripping a carpet. And, you know, I think all of these aspects, all of these kind of like sensorial, you know, aspects were ways that she could really like take up space online, you know, and also to like kind of cite her in a real like location, let's say. You know, I think that she had been working a lot, like a lot of performance artists in early COVID, just with Zoom and this kind of, you know, this exact space we're in right now, where, you know, like it's very frontal, you know, like you feel like the only things you can do are like get closer or further away from your screen. But, you know, I think for her in this project, she was really like making clear that she was a body in space, like, and not just trapped in an apartment during lockdown, or like taking up all this space, you know, as much as possible over the course of these 4 weeks. And so, you know, at the end of these 4 weeks, you know, people who had been watching these shows really didn't believe they were live. You know, they thought that this was all like scripted and planned, and it was the complete opposite. It was all totally improvised. in terms of Autumn's performance, in terms of the camera positions, in terms of the editing, in terms of lighting and sound. It's this really collaborative process that we, really lucked out with, let's say, like, in terms of people coming together for the first time, in months and sharing space together and, feeling that kind of like synergistic energy to create this totally new project for us, which the kitchen had never done any live stream before. Autumn hadn't really done anything like this before. So in the end, it was just like, I think something that really helped all the other artists that were doing projects for the screen during COVID, after Autumn, just like really understand like how far we can take this, right? Like it doesn't just have to be like, like again, a Zoom play or something like that. But maybe I will just share this one last project really quickly before we open up for Q&A, which I hope people have some questions because I always love to hear from the audience. But this is a project that happened right after Autumn's project with Baseera Khan. And, it came out of this really similar desire to expand one's world during lockdown and the kind of like role of the screen within it. And so Baseera is a visual artist who works in performance as well. And I invited them to do a residency at a satellite space that we were using mostly during COVID called Queens Lab. And Queens Lab is in Ridgewood, Queens, which is a kind of industrial neighborhood. Well, it's industrial, residential, has a lot of, music and art spaces, but is like a place where you can just have an immense amount of space, let's say. So Queens Lab is this kind of massive warehouse space that's situated inside an artist studio who very generously gave it to us during this time. But, as you can see from this image, Queens Lab is definitely not a gallery or a theater. It's, it really doesn't have the trappings of either of those. And so what Baseera set out to do was to create this 3D or 2D replica of their apartment and to film a television pilot called By Faith within it. And the concept was quite simple. It was that, Baseera had not been able to see this very intimate circle of friends and supporters during COVID. One's, people that they felt were really essential to their kind of survival in New York as an artist, as a person. And so kind of constructed this, way for them to be together and to do the things that they would usually do together, like make dinner, drink wine, paint, et cetera, et cetera. So this is her and the painter Amy Solomon, who is one of the friends who came into the set. But so the way that it was structured was that Baseera would invite these friends over. They would do the thing they would usually do, make dinner, paint, etc. That would all be filmed. The rehearsals, and we called those rehearsals, even though there was nothing being rehearsed, let's say. But that footage was streamed silently on the kitchen's Twitch channel. And then Baseera and their collaborator, Ethan Weinstock, would take like 5 minutes from that, those rehearsals, and then turn that into a script. And then, the friends would come back and reshoot just that 5 minutes as a scripted performance. And then Baseera is in the process of editing all of this together into a television pilot. That will hopefully debut in the next few months or so. But, this was like, Baseera obviously has, I'm saying obviously because Amy Solomon is a really amazing painter and incredible conversationalist, but, the other people Baseera had come in were like the performance artist Vaginal Davis, Leah Gangitano, who is an incredible curator. So these are all like really, the artist Rico Gatson, like, all of these really fascinating people that had very rich conversations with Baseera during this time. And it was this really like, they were able to create these really intimate moments kind of within the film set, and within this kind of like strange in-between space that was like, very comfortable because it's Baseera's apartment, but it's really just, this set. And, in this case, we haven't yet shown like the final product, but really like thought through all these different ways to like show this process, let people into this process, but also kind of like, protect the kind of intimate relationships that were happening, within this set. So this was something that was like very new to me as a curator, and I think very new to everyone involved. I mean, Baseera has never made a television pilot before, but really just spoke to like the kind of in-between states that we were all in terms of like, like watching so much TV that you like think those are your friends, or, dream, like having like a COVID fever dream about like being together at a party, again, during the most intense moments of lockdown. So yeah, I think I'm going to stop there, and then hopefully there are some questions, and I'm open to answering really anything in terms of general kitchen questions about the projects, general performance curating questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lumi, for that wonderful talk. And maybe I'll just start out with a question for you. I really love the kind of question you brought up around what is the role of the kitchen now that there's so many other spaces that do work similar, that's not streamlined museum or gallery work that is presented in these spaces. And it seems like it's still, I also love the Kevin Beasley example, because it seems like it allows artists to reinvent themselves, so they don't have to kind of like maintain a singular identity, and it becomes a space of exploration. And then of course my immediate question was like, how did you as an institution learn alongside of that? And you already had this answer of you're like hitting all my questions. You had this answer of the coming up with the artist residency, that seeing process. So I guess I'm kind of curious, after a few of these residencies, like what is your take now? How is the institution evolving? What are some of the outcomes of these kinds of shifts in programming? I mean, it seems so amazing, just the various different things you consider art, and the way that they start to kind of compound each other, and the kinds of different questions that they pose and ask, and they become, as you said, the word legibility, they become legible to different audiences. So it's not about this way of like being opaque, but it's just being specific to various audiences. So yeah, I guess I'm really curious about the changes that you're imagining moving forward from these conversations, projects.
Yeah, I think for all of these residencies to also coincide with COVID was like this, very strange timing, because in a way it like worked out so well, in that, we could, our typical model of programming was to always have an exhibition and performances happening at the same time in the same building. As a curator, I would often be like moving between these two spaces, and not that it was like dividing our attention or anything like that, but it was just a different way of like inhabiting the space. And I think with the residency model, just being allowed to like focus so clearly on like this one, you're kind of just like building this world together and like living within it for a few weeks. And the thing that I think happened during COVID that was very like COVID specific was actually that like, we built the residency so that it wouldn't be product oriented necessarily. Like, we didn't need someone to come in and like pitch an idea necessarily and have that be the outcome. We wanted to leave space for like, just, I don't know, general experimentation or, just this idea that you're there with your resources for a couple of weeks, but everyone did want to move towards like, I think because like all these other opportunities had fallen away during COVID, like they did want to move towards like this one big project. And so I think like, it seemed like we were taking on all this really ambitious work during COVID, which we did, but that was not the intention necessarily. And so I think now that we are back with a public kind of, we're open at like half capacity for performances, but we're not doing as much online programming. Like the shift has become towards like these other intimate ways of relating with the audience. So for example, we started off our season with a residency by the performance artist and comedian Sophia Clearly that was only for one person at a time. And so it was like this full on kind of theatrical, one woman show, but it was just for this one audience member. Or, right now I'm doing a residency with the performance artist, Alex Tatarsky, and Alex has structured their residency to have like weekly, like what they call studio visits. And so they like, we just had the first one last night and it's like, has the kind of like structure of a show because Alex is a performer, but it's really about like being able to, let the audience into the process in a different way. And also to really focus on like what Alex calls like the scraps, like this idea that, all these experiments and shows that she didn't get to do during COVID, like all those scraps that have accumulated are really like, can just be as generative as like the whole, right? Like, and kind of calling into questions like issues of, like performative labor in that sense, and like what you come to a residency to do every day. And is it to work? Is it to like be yourself? Is it to, just look at a compost pile, which is something like Alex might do for a while, So it's like, yeah, now that we've opened back up, like continuing this, like these different strains of inquiry into like what it means to like share work with the public again.
Thank you so much. I guess I have one other question also in terms of that COVID in some ways provided access because everybody's stuck in their portal of the screen. And it seems like there's something about performance that's so related to community and place and site and being there, all of those really important elements. And I'm just kind of curious about that notion of access and what has COVID changed for you as an institution, as a curator that's based within performance. Like are any of those ideas carried over in specific ways, that the kind of expansion of community into these other spaces through technology? Or I'm just kind of curious about that because there's something so incredible about that one person, the idea of that, that these are groundbreaking ways that still we engage with audience, because everything is supposed to be for everyone in some ways, and to have a one-on-one experience is actually what's novel, right? So I'm kind of curious about the tensions between those things as well for you as a curator and maybe for the field at large.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, this idea of like online access was one we really, quite frankly, struggled with because we never had to do it before, like we were forced into doing it like a lot of other performance spaces. And that, like that says a lot about like what people Well, I mean, I think for us, it was a lot about like what artists came to the kitchen for. Like, I think they were very resistant. They were all super resistant to like online programming, and, you know, have always been. And I think there's a lot of really complex relationships to like documentation and just the general kind of like codification of performance through image and language and, you know, all of these different different things that aren't just like sitting in a room with the performance, you know, like that being the only way to experience things. And I think that you know, this past year has really shown us that like we don't have to compromise the artistic projects, you know, through this online presentation or this reimagining for online presentation. But I think that audience question is still just such a struggle because there was never, you know, I think like there were certain like when we did more kind of casual live streams, we would have like the chat box open and, you know, like right now, you know, it's not like people are like chatting away and like as if they're like at a bar, you know, or like in the audience together. But you know, we never really like found a way to like get that like audience reaction that was so crucial to performance. And I think that's something that's like, it's such a barrier, you know. It's like, even though let's say you go to a show and you leave the theater and maybe you don't talk to anyone in the audience or you don't have like any interactions anyway, but it's something that I think is just so like intrinsic to the like site of performance, and it's something that's like very difficult for us to get over, you know. So I hope that, you know, like all of these lessons that we learned during COVID aren't forgotten. I think, and COVID is obviously not anywhere near over. So, you know, it's like, I think a lot of us have talked about in performance, have talked about like before COVID and after COVID times. And I think it's like, there is no before and after. This is just like, this is our permanent way of being. And we need to work within these like, you know, new ways of presentation, these new ways of access, and to improve the experience for everybody, you know, and that includes like artists and audiences and the institutions, because, you know, we've all struggled with like the extra labor that it takes to do this work and to, you know, to make it like truly accessible, which, you know, I completely understand that like the kitchen's online programming is not, you know, so that's like all I'm saying. There's a lot of different issues caught up in it. And I think performance is like still, you know, we're working in like these very, not like strict modalities, but just being like, it's, you know, it's based on so many things like box office and you know, like just the business of being a performance space. But, you know, this idea that you either have to like be back to normal and have full capacity on Broadway or at the opera or whatever, or you have to be, you know, totally online or something like that. So I think we're still navigating these waters.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because it's almost like the audiences have to relearn how to be the audience has to relearn how to be an audience in some ways, right?
Absolutely.
It's like you're in a space, but you're a body, you produce heat, you have facial expressions, and it's a really different kind of.
It's a really different thing. Yeah, I mean, just yesterday with Alex's first performance, Alex Tversky's first performance, like they made a joke about like, you know, the audience not remembering how to like clap at first because it was like strangely silent, you know, and we're like, remember to like clap now.
Yeah.
But yeah, all those things that it feels very strange to like share space again in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to be mindful of time. Maybe one last question around future projects that you're excited about. Could you tell us a little bit about what's on the horizon that you're really excited about?
Sure. Well, let's see.
If you can share with us.
What can I talk about? I mean, I think that, I'm finishing out these next few weeks with artist Alex Starsky, and um, uh, that being like a residency where, as I mentioned, like there is no like finished product at the end. And so to me, I'm really excited just to see how this develops over the next few weeks. But then next project will be with the artist E. Jane, who was, as I mentioned, was part of Kevin Beasley's assembly project. But we'll be doing an exhibition together in the spring that's in the theater, and that's really combining both E's work as a visual artist and the musical work of Misa, their alter ego, and kind of like using the kind of like role of Misa as like a diva to like, kind of refuse certain exhibition modes that E. Jane is working in. So it's like the two personas are like kind of in tension with each other. Yeah, I think that's what I can reveal about that project.
Actually, I do have one more question for you.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your creative role in relation to the artists you work with? For example, you often speak of we did this or that, like just like this idea of, the role of the producer, curator in relation, and the role of, I guess, the institution, right, in bringing in the work. So that was
absolutely. Yeah. So I think my role is really fluid. For me, it's a lot about sensing how much the artist wants me to be involved or not. I think as like a curator in a visual art space, you're kind of thought of as like the person who makes all the decisions, and the person who says no, and like the public face of the work, for the institution, because the artist isn't there every day. And so, for me, I think it's very different. It's really like I think everything I showed you today was very much like, was very, I mean, I won't say collaborative, but I think like there's like, because I don't, it's the artist's work, and I'm very much like learning everything kind of like from their process, but it's something that's, I would say, like very involved with like the institution as like people, and like that, our production team, for example, I think is as influential, in their role as I am in my role, which is really crucial to like artists being able to produce something that they've never done before, which is very, very often the case at the kitchen. So, there are times when, of course, we don't do commissions. We do just like touring shows, for example. So, a dance company or a theater company comes in, they're doing a show they've done many times before. I have a very light footprint on, on the actual work. I'm just there to like be an institutional liaison and make sure everything's running right, and all of that stuff. And then there are the cases like, Tina Satter and Straddle, which is a touring theater company. But, Tina and I have had a lot of conversations about like how the kitchen is the only place that they do shows where there is this role of a curator, and like, I don't know if like Tina knows exactly like how that like helps her, like her practice necessarily, but she was like, I wish there was a curator at every single institution instead of just a producer. It's like someone who's like just kind of like administrating everything, but there's like, someone who's actually like receiving ideas on the other end of this, and like, really like engaging in certain conversations, even if those conversations have no impact on the final, on the final presentation or the final project, but is really just like a sounding board, or like, someone that I mean, essentially just like a human that you can have a connection to within an institution. And so, yeah, I do say we a lot, and I feel like that was warranted in all of the projects I showed, but there are many projects where it is not a we necessarily, and it's just to them, and they're fully independent, and just like I don't want to interfere. I don't need to interfere with anything necessarily, but that's I think when you're doing commission as a curator, it's like a different project. I mean, a different process.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, right? Because in these big productions with people not having done the work before, it's like everything is being made on the spot, and it's being made with multiple people.
Exactly.
And that's just the reality of it. It's a we. It's definitely a we.
Exactly. And like more often than not, I don't have any idea what's happening until it happens. I mean, not any idea, but like 80% of the idea until it actually like opens, or the show opens, the exhibition opens, the performance opens, we start the stream, whatever.
You have the trust.
Exactly. Exactly. It's all about the trust.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think a lot of times it's a we, even when a lot of us artists don't say we, we is always part of the equation, right? Well, thank you so much, Lumi. Thank you for your generosity and sharing with us your work. It's so exciting, and it was so wonderful to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk with you, and I hope everyone can come to the kitchen at some point, and that I can come to Oregon at some point.
Yeah, enjoy your time with the Oregon artists and at the Ford Family Foundation events.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a good night.